Our discussion that we're going to have now takes place in the context of the Charlotte Maxeke Mary Robinson Research Chair. And we are very pleased that right now we have Lynne Parker and Morna Regan visiting us as part of that chair. And it is 3 years ago, 3 years and 3 months, that we gathered in this room for the inauguration of the chair. The chair it's a chair in Irish studies, but some of us also think of it as a chair in comparative Irish and South African experiences of colonialism. So it's very interesting. And at that event, where the speech was given by the then Deputy Prime Minister, now the Taoiseach, Michael Martin, those contradictions were on display. It was very interesting how Ireland understands itself, either as part of Europe or as an ex-colony, and maybe not both. Because 2 months before that event, in fact, just 6 weeks before that event, a very important event occurred in Dublin. Namely, Trinity College returned the remains that had been taken from a churchyard in Innisboffin, in the far west of Ireland, returned these remains to the church. And the reason why this is important is because those remains were collected on the advice of Alfred Court Haddon, of Indigenous Irish people, for the purposes of racial study inside of the Protestant university. It's very interesting to think how Irish people went through that experience of being the subject of racial science. Because the very same British anthropologist, Alfred Court Haddon, in South Africa, a decade later, made the recommendation that the bodies of Khoisan people be studied by museums, which led to the caste-making project, and it led to the theft of the remains of people from their graves. So there is so much that Ireland and South Africa share. And we put this to Michael Martin at that meeting. But it was more important for him to talk about Ireland as Europe rather than those colonial legacies. And tonight we are very pleased to have Lynne and Morna with us to talk about these legacies, to talk about borders, to talk about settler colonialism, and about the ways in which people continue to be divided, and how theatre and the arts have been dealing with these questions and these legacies. This is your opportunity. They both come from amazing backgrounds in theatre, as director and as writer and as actor, and they are celebrated, much celebrated colleagues, and it is wonderful that they are here with us. Thank you.
I just want to thank Moritz and Pramesh and Lamise and Michaela for getting us here. It's been a real tonic for us, a real shot in the arm. And I also want to thank Eve Patton, who is the former director of the Trinity Long Room Hub. And while I was doing a residency there, she said, I must get you to South Africa. And I went, okay, and thought no more about it until pretty recently. And suddenly here we are. And it's been just amazing. So thank you. I was talking to her maybe a couple of months ago, and she realized that I was a little daunted at the prospect of coming by myself. What was I going to tell everybody? And she said, why don't you see if the Irish Embassy would help us to bring someone else? And they have. Thank you very much, Skull. So the obvious person to do that, to come with me in the context of what we've been discussing, I felt was Morna, who is a very celebrated and leading writer of plays, was an actor, and is now a screenwriter as well, and was born in Derry. And I was born in Belfast. So we're both from the same hinterland, but we have very, very different experiences of that place. Because I was, even though I have an atheist Republican mother, I was born into the Protestant tradition, and Morna was born into the Catholic tradition. So, and I'm also a good bit older than Morna. So I left Northern Ireland, and she was still there experiencing the Troubles. Just for context, I'm sure you all know that for centuries, Ireland was united under British rule, but just over 100 years ago threw off that yoke. But there was a little corner of the country that didn't want to do that at all. And so the country was partitioned in 1921. And that has led to all sorts of trouble, which we literally call the Troubles. And sometimes they explode, and sometimes they literally explode, and sometimes they go underground. When I was born in the early 60s, it was kind of a golden time, and there was a great deal of optimism and prosperity. And then in 1969, that all changed, and the Troubles came back in force. But I left in 1979. Before I hand over to Morna, I'm just going to read you something that was written by my uncle, who was a playwright. His name is Stuart Parker. And it sort of tells you a little bit. It's a good way of summing up the conundrum of being Northern Irish. So here's what he says. The ancestral wraiths at my own elbow are, amongst other things, Scots-Irish, Northern English, immigrant Huguenot, in short, the usual Belfast mongrel crew, who have contrived between them to entangle me in the whole Irish-British cat's cradle, and thus to bequeath to me a subject for drama, which is comprised of multiplying dualities. 2 Irelands, the British Isles, 2 Irelands, 2 Ulsters, 2 men fighting over a field. And that kind of sums up very nicely what the Irish condition is and what Irish drama frequently deals with. So I'm gonna kick off the conversation by asking Morna to tell us a little bit of her experience of Derry and the Troubles as a child, and how she ended up in the theatre. So off you go.
As Lynne said, we occupied the same geographical space, but 2 very, very different places. Even the fact that my city has 2 names, Derry, which is the city I come from, and Londonderry, which is the city that Lynne might give the name to, not anymore, but Lynne's tradition. You've already said the corner of Ireland that people didn't want to give to Ireland, but that was only one voice. So there was a clamour, obviously, on the other side to not be part of Britain, and still that clamour. And I think we would both be on the same side as that now. So growing up in Derry in the 80s, it was grim. It was a very dark decade here and in South Africa. At the same, Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister, and at the time that she was denying sanctions to apartheid era South Africa, she was also letting the hunger strikers in Northern Ireland die one after another. So that was a reign of terror, because that meant every night you would hear the bin lids going, which meant another man had died. And the streets would be rioting, there would be arrests, there would be great unrest. But as a teenager, it was a state of terror all the time, tension, knowing that something could happen at any time. And Derry, there's a river that runs through the city, and it is a border. It's not called that, but it is a border. So that the Catholic nationalist working class are on one side, my side, and the loyalist Protestant, more middle class, would have been on the other side. So it was our side that suffered those atrocities. So it was dark, but there were glimmers of hope. And for me, one of the places of colour and light was a workshop that used to come from Belfast to us in our summer holidays, called Neighbourhood Open Workshops, or they could also be called Net for Pret. It was based on, or Akwandu. It was people like the people that we met here speaking the other night that were so awe-inspiring to me. And I remembered that I had met those people, and that they had shown me that there's another way. There is another tribe. There is joy and fun. And so I loved these people. What is funny is I don't remember any of the games, exercises, shows, any of that, but I remember the people and the fun, and they didn't seem to be under the yoke. They seemed to be a otherness, a tribe apart. And I felt like I recognized them, or I recognized something that I'd not been able to recognize before. When I was growing up, I was very much aware, and it was drilled into me, all the things that I was not. I was not British, I was not a Protestant, and I was not a boy. So those things were really drilled home. And suddenly I was with people who were reflecting back to me the things that I was and or could be. So I knew, I was too young to articulate it, but that I had found my tribe. But then they went away. One summer I was waiting for them and they didn't come. So I'm imagining that was funding cuts, something we all know about. So plunged back to darkness for a while, until one summer, a bit older, having a cigarette out my bedroom window, which I'm not supposed to be doing. And it's a terrace, end of terrace house. I'm quite high up and on the end of a hill, and I can see, I have a good view, and I could see these people, and I was going, what's going on down there? I mean, there were, again, a splash of colour. There was a cape, there was a fedora. I mean, in Derry in the 80s, there was a cane swinging, there was flamboyance, there was attitude, there was confidence. This was something I was not used to seeing. And somebody told me, oh, that's Field Day Theatre Company. They're rehearsing. And I had heard of them. In fact, I had actually seen their inaugural show, translations, Brian Friel's translations, which I'll talk about in a little while. I was 12. I didn't really understand what that play was, and haven't been in 3 productions of it since, and haven't seen many productions. And I picked it up and had a look through it again last night, and I am still learning what that play is about. It is still yielding and unfolding its secrets and its meanings. It's an incredible piece of work, but we can talk about that in a minute. So I saw these people and I thought, I have to be there. So I went down to the building that they were going into, which was the building next to our house, very austere building that had been a Protestant boys' school. So 2 of the things I'm not allowed to be or go into, but I did. And I said, I'm on my school holidays. Can I volunteer? Can I do anything? And I was like, yeah, absolutely. Put to work for Field Day on Pentecost, the play that Lynne has just quoted from, by her husband. And Lynne was a young, oh, sorry, your uncle. Lynne was a young, your assistant director, you weren't quite as observer. So we glanced off each other then. We didn't really connect. We were both young, and both, we were talking about this last night, both quite intimidated. So just as you are at that age, sort of just hanging on for dear life. But it was so seminal for me, that play. That is a play as well, Pentecost, that has come back into my life over and over and keeps giving. I'm going to let Lynne really talk about that one. But just to say one thing about it, Lynne's uncle, Stuart, a beautiful man who very sadly died quite soon after this production. And I think we definitely, both and many people in Ireland, feel the loss of what his canon would have been if he hadn't been taken so young by cancer. I think we only got probably the beginning of what his brilliance, if he'd had the time to write, God knows what he would have given us on top of already amazing work. So Pentecost was opening in Derry. And I should say something about Field Day, I think, first. So Field Day Theatre Company was founded in 1980 in Derry, and they consisted of already world-class poets and theatre makers and actors who were cleaning up in Broadway and the West End. Names you might know: Brian Friel, Seamus Heaney, Tom Paul and Seamus Dean. But what they were choosing to do was give these world premieres to Derry, which didn't have a theatre, even though it was the second city of Northern Ireland. It was very neglected, no theatre. And they produced and performed their premieres in the city and then toured it around tiny little church halls, like real podunk places around Northern Ireland. They brought theatre to people who would otherwise not have got to see it. But their ethos was very interesting. So there are 4 provinces in Ireland, one of which is occupied, that's Ulster. And their ethos was to create a 5th province, a place where, an imagined place where the divisive and rigid sectarian stereotypes could be dropped, and as Lynne said, the mongrel tribe could come together and try to find a place where we could start to build a future together, look for a hopeful passage from our history to our future, which is very much, to me, what I've been listening to you all talk about this week. It feels like that is what we have done. And I mean, I should say this, for anyone who hasn't worked it out already, I am not an academic. Why are you laughing? So I was quite baffled. Why are we here? But then listening to you all talk, I realized, well, of course, theatre is the ultimate liminal space. It really is. It's where we put our work into practice, and we may not understand the theory all the time in an intellectual way, but we know it by God when it's in our bodies and it's in the space and we're making it happen. And I think I had a wonderful teacher in Los Angeles who talked about exactly that liminality, the space that we're in. And he said, I think as students you might recognize this. You know when a teacher teaches you something, or a professor or whatever, but you were taught something and then you only learn it 5 years later, 10 years later, when you go, you have the moments, that's what that was. He used to say how much he hated imagination, which really kind of struck me, because we'd come through school being taught this is the kingdom, this is where what you cherry pick from and create from. He said, your imagination is only reshuffled frames of already held frames of reference. He said, that's not what you need. You need to be in the place of uncertainty. You need to be in a place where you don't know what's going to happen next, and you need to be ready for it. So he called that spontaneity, and his whole how to get into a state of spontaneity, to get past the fear, trust that there will be a place of arrival, and then also trust that that place of arrival will not be there when you get there. That if it's really working, you will constantly be in movement and moving forward. And then it reminded me of Andreas's opening talk, which I loved, about the island being a point of arrival, but then also that island could be floating. So I understand, I guess, why we're here. So Field Day, their 5th province idea, in a way, embodies that, I think. They were very much about looking for a place where we could come together and look into the scary place and what might be a future for all of us. So it was very exciting. I didn't realize it at the time, but again, as I get older and older, how special it was to have been there and to have, this is me showing off a little bit now, I was the tea girl on Brian Frield's Making History, which is a play that I know Pramesh is writing about at the minute, so just put that out there. But I'm slightly waffling. I do vaguely know where I'm going. Hang in there. So the Pentecost, on the opening night, I was so excited to have been a part of it and so excited to go in and sit in the Guildhall in Derry, which is not a theatre, I've just said, was actually the citadel of unionist politics. And so Brian Field Day made a decision to stage the play somewhere in a space that belonged to the other side, the other tradition, so that they would feel welcome and come. And in fact, everybody came to a Field Day opening. It was very dangerous not to be there, to not know what was said. Because they were quietly subversive, but also very welcoming. Friel talked about his plays as being stepping stones to the other side. Again, crossing borders, liminal spaces, bringing people in. But on the opening night, as I was about to go in and sit down and watch it, Stuart just tapped me and said, Stuart Parker, the writer, he said, "Will you sit out here with me?" He was scared. He didn't, or anxious. He did not want to watch the play in front of an audience, but he didn't want to, it appeared, be on his own either. So the little bit of me was a bit disappointed because I wanted to see it. Another bit of me was delighted to get this man to myself. So we paced up and down. And he didn't really want to talk to me that much either. He just didn't want to be, I guess, on his own. And then we went into a little side room and he gave me a glass of whiskey. I was about 17. Nobody had done that before. I was being treated like a grown-up. I was delighted with myself. And he said, "What do you want to do or be?" And I said out loud for the first time to anyone, including myself really, "I want to be an actor." I couldn't believe the word. I can still remember it, that I had actually said that. And he didn't even flinch. And he said, "I can see you in this play one day." And you know when you have moments in your life and something reveals itself to you and you know it is a fundamental truth? That was one of those moments. I thought that will be an arrival point for me at some point in my life. And lo and behold, many years later it was when I walked into Lynne's audition room for a part in Lynne's incredible production of Pentecost, and we got to work together on that show. So I love when things come full circle. So that was Field Day. And I was not working with them in any professional capacity. I was still doing A-levels and deciding what to do. And Derry, there was another kind of unspoken border in Northern Ireland. There's a river that runs down vertically down the middle called the Bann. And there's a saying west of the Bann. So Derry is here. Let's say Belfast is there. London is over here. There's the Bann. And that the money from London, Belfast never really gets past the Bann, because Derry is very nationalist. And I've heard it said several times this week that funding is a very political issue. What gets funded, what voices get to be heard, what don't. So I think we can understand each other very much there. So there was no university in Derry. There was no option to stay. There was no work. Nobody stayed. Everybody left, 17, 18, everybody was gone. So I left. And I regret it, because once you go, it's very hard, I've discovered, to go back. But there wasn't anything there. So off I went to London. That was fine. I did my degree and didn't want to go back to Northern Ireland. Didn't know what to do. I'm looking like the rest of the Irish diaspora towards America. And I applied for a scholarship and got it. And it was a very exciting time. It was a big scholarship. And I had 2 years paid tuition and stipend to do an MFA in Los Angeles. It was so exciting. I could not believe it. And my parents were delighted. Everyone was delighted. About a week before I'm due to go, the provost, the dean, calls me into his office. Very English gentleman. And he says, "Morna, we cannot let you go." And he had my passport sitting in front of him, my green passport. And he said, "This is a British scholarship." And it was taken away from me. And I know, I was heartbroken. And I rang my mother, who's a rabid nationalist. And I told her what happened. And she said, "Give me till the end of the week." couple of days later, my mother produces a British passport for me. And she says, take it, they owe you. Live your life. It signifies nothing. It's a piece of paper. And she gave me her permission and my freedom to go. It was an incredible act. I think about it a lot. It was an incredible act. Now, and thankfully, I never really had to use that passport, except to break the law, which I'm quite proud of. I got a green card at one stage for the States, so I would travel in on my Irish passport and out on that British one so that nobody really knew where I was. And this was pre 9/11, so it had its uses. It had its uses, that British passport, but that chapter of my life did not end well, which was nothing to do with the Brits. I can't blame them for that. So off I went to America. And I had an incredible time and I got my incredible education. And the first play that I did in America after it, in West Hollywood, tiny little theatre there, was Translations, Brian Friel. So my first professional production. A few weeks prior to that, I had been in the Beverly Center, the mall, the big mall in Hollywood. And for the first time ever in my life, I heard Irish spoken. In that weird place, I heard two girls standing right beside a guy, and they were looking at him and going, "Buchel jazz, nak will she and shaw and shaw." They're saying, "Look at him, isn't he a ride?" Right beside him. And I went, "Oh my God, that's Irish." And then about 2 weeks later, one of those girls got cast in Translations with me and became a very good friend. So in LA, for the first time ever in my life, I got to hang out with what I was considering at the time real Irish people. They were all from the Republic, are still really good friends of mine. And I was very glamoured by them, very in love with them. The sense of humour, the crack, their lightness, the go, the fun, all of that. And it was so strange to be in a fake set, polystyrene set made to look like stone, of a little hedge school that would be 50 miles down the road from where my parents live now, but 150 years ago, with people from Ireland learning for the first time what Irishness was, what Irishness meant, what it sounded like and looked like. And much as I loved it, I looked at it and realised for the first time, I am not that. Whatever this is, it is not me. And I was heartbroken. I didn't understand what was happening until one of the actors' late cast came in, a big Ulster Protestant boy, technically my enemy. And I went, "Oh, my people are here." So straight away, we understood each other. We knew how to code and decode. We knew what the signifiers were. We knew what was funny, what was not funny. We knew what to say, what not to say, when, and what you could and couldn't say, particularly what was funny. And I realised that actually I'm Northern Irish. I am that motley crew. I am an inhabitant of that 5th province. It took me a long time to realise that was okay, that I was not in any way betraying being Irish. And as an artist, I think about that all the time, how to get to that place and honour it. And then post the Good Friday Agreement, which was 1998, so 4 years after apartheid, we looked to South Africa a lot, what was happening here. 4 years after that, we got peace, a charter for peace in Northern Ireland. And shortly after that, a strange thing happened. You'd be filling in a standard form, which used to be a tyranny for people from Northern Ireland, because as soon as I said, I put my postcode in, my only option was to tick Londonderry. And then the next thing was, I live in Britain. And the next thing is, I'm British. And that drove me mad. There seemed to be no escape from that. And suddenly, for the first time ever, Northern Ireland was an option. And I felt like, oh, that's me. Maybe the first time I felt like I was at home, I recognized that. So I feel for people who never were able to fill in a box properly, maybe their gender or their nationality, various different things. I think, yeah, sometimes you need to be at home in a drop-down box. So that's a very long-winded way of getting did I answer the question? Even slightly? Yeah, it wasn't a question, thank God. So I'm going to pass it back to Lynne. And she can, just going to chat across each other. But I'd like to introduce Lynne a little bit first. I know that you all know she's the artistic director of Rough Magic Theatre Company, and you've seen the caliber of the work that they do is outstanding. And Rough Magic is 40 years old, 41 now, 41. And Lynne is one of our leading, most eminent, most rated theatre people in the whole country. Not just because she is in and of herself brilliant, and the company is also brilliant. And like Field Day, everybody wants to know, what's Rough Magic at? What are they doing? How can I be a part of it? But one of the things that sets Lynne apart is, while other companies and theatres would take the Arts Council funding and enhance maybe one career of an artistic director, maybe one of a writer, Lynne takes that and has founded around Rough Magic a seeds program, years and years of training young people, training young directors who are now her direct competition. What an act of generosity. Training the producers and writers, giving writers the opportunity, of which I myself have benefited, though not from that program, too old. And the many, many actors who have come up through it. So I think there's probably nobody in Ireland who did not get, whose career hasn't entwined and got a bump up from Lynne at some point. So delighted to introduce to you and to ask Lynne. And to ask of you a similar question, why you left the North and went to Trinity and started your company.
Can I just say that no one in my family ever referred to your hometown as anything but Derry? Anything but. And it's interesting because, I'm from the Protestant side, but my family was never the hardline loyalist side. They were all pretty smart, lovely people. And very much, including my uncle. But, you know, when I was a child, what I didn't realize was that due to this partition, and it was very badly handled, and it's not even an accurate partition of the part of Ireland that is called Ulster. It carves Ulster into, and it did end up setting up a state that's disproportionately favoured the Protestant community. I wasn't aware of that when I was 4, you know. And it never occurred to me as a small child that the state would do anything other than the normal things, look after you, support you, protect you, and so forth. And it was only after 1969 that I realised that that was really very much not the case for a very large part of my community in the wider sense. And things got pretty grim, but my parents did as much as they could, and it was considerable, to shield myself and my sister from what was going on. So we grew up in a leafy suburb that was not very far from Stormont, the government building. And we were a working class family. We were not privileged, but we were upwardly mobile, as I think Morna's was too, you know. We're part of that generation that had benefited from the National Health Service and free education and all of that kind of thing. So we were, you know, education was the big route. And I know a lot of people will have that experience. But it was protected. There's no question. But I began to realize that not only was it protecting me, and there's something interesting that Promise talked about the other night, that it was protecting me, it was also keeping me away from life. I mean, there was a real sense in which you weren't connecting with the means of growing up, of living. You couldn't go into town. I mean, it was far too dangerous. And it was boring. It was boring. Now, that's not as bad as being terrifying, but it's not great. So there were little windows into a world that I knew I was connected to, but not properly. And they would, BBC Northern Ireland would run a little programme where on kind of Friday nights, very late, you would get Gaelic music, you would get Irish traditional music, Clannad and the like, and Andy Irvine and Paul Brady. And I looked through this little window and I thought, I need to get more of that. So when I was 18, two things happened. well, three things. Margaret Thatcher got elected. Um, I was applying to university, and I also went to London to the National Youth Theatre of Great Britain, which is where I got the absolute bug. And I knew that's what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. I had had a little inkling before because my uncle had written a play called Spoke Song, which was a play set in Belfast, taking it through cycles of history, cycle pun intended, through by being set in a little bicycle shop and looking at all the different eras of history and interlaced with music hall songs. Fabulous play. And I went to see it in Dublin when I was 14, and my aunt took me to see Trinity College as part of the sightseeing. I thought it'd be lovely to come here. And that's what ended up happening. So I got the theatre bug. I was going to Trinity. Trinity was then one of the few ways you could get into professional theatre. There was no drama degree. Talk about imposter syndrome, to go back to day one. I am entitled to imposter syndrome because I have no training whatsoever in drama, not any at all. It just didn't exist. The Samuel Beckett Centre, which now exists in Trinity, was set up after I left. So I knew that I wanted to find out what this whole thing was about, and this was the way to do it. I didn't know what directing was. I'd never really heard of directing or directors. You heard of producers and things. But I realized that I was kind of a bit good at English. I was a bit good at art, and I was a bit good at history, and a little bit good at music, and not brilliant at any of these things. But if you put them all together, then I actually added up to more than the sum of my parts. So that's what directing is for me. It's pulling on little bits of kind of know-how, gathering it all together, and seeing if you can help somebody who is actually really good at any of these things make work. And so my college career taught me that. I did get a degree by some miracle, but most of my time was spent in learning a trade, and the trade was theatre. So we set up our company, me and Declan Hughes, in the summer of 1984, and we gathered together a very motley crew. And at the end of a summer season, in which at the end of it, I think we got paid £100, Irish pounds, which was actually pretty good in those days. We became a collective that went on and then sort of cut our teeth on plays that nobody else was doing, like David Mamet or Carol Churchill or Timberlake Wertenbaker. Nobody in Ireland was looking at that work because they were either looking back, which was the Abbey, looking at the past, or looking at the kind of I suppose the European tradition at the gate, but not really. It was more like, it was just constant posh drama. And we wanted to say, we're kids of the television age, let's face it. We're an internationally informed generation. We have to start admitting that. Incidentally, I had three friends when I was at college who were variously from Galway, London and Dublin. And so I'm from Belfast. And I realized that there was, very interestingly, a border in Ireland that ran vertically, but a bit like your border in the Man. The border was created, and bear with me here, by the BBC. Because the BBC was broadcasting, and this is before cable television, and on the east side of the country, you could pick up the BBC and the British television channels. And this was the enlightened, wonderful BBC that has kind of slightly disappeared. So anyone who lived in Belfast and Dublin was getting the same cultural input as the person living in London. So three of us had exactly the same cultural language, and the person who lived in Galway was only getting RTE, only the two channels, and had a completely different sense of identity. And that vertical border, invisible border, ran until cable came, and now everybody gets everything all the time, and the spaces is liminal as all get out. But it was quite an important demarcation in those days. As to my sense of origin, I really couldn't get out of Northern Ireland fast enough. And I suppose that was followed in many ways by the people who were getting out of Ireland as quickly as they could, because we're talking about a time of deep recession, no jobs. Was nothing going on. And in theatre, the Abbey had shut down its training department. The Gate was in free fall. There was nothing to do but do it yourself. So unless you got on the plane and went to New York, you were going to have to make something happen yourself. And I think that was a really big bit of luck. Now, for our 40th anniversary, we got together some of the other companies that started at the same time, because it wasn't just Rough Magic. There was Charabang in Belfast, Red Kettle in Waterford, The Passion Machine, an amazing company in Dublin that were our exact contemporaries. And we all, the historian Dermot Ferreter chaired this, and he filled everyone in about how dreadful Ireland was. And it was. I mean, at that time, we are talking about extraordinary religious repression of women. We're talking about the really nasty, the hunger strikes, all of that stuff. Nobody had any money. And yet we remembered it to a person as a time of intense momentum and real joy. And we had such fun because it was cheap to live in Ireland in those days. You could exist on nothing. Everybody was on the dole, including me. I was scheduling my rehearsals around people's dole appointments, and including my own. But that was the state subsidy that wasn't available in any other form. And it was fine. You know, everybody knew, and we all just got on with it. And that explosion of talent and do-it-yourself, can-do attitude was, to me, the flowering of Irish theatre. And there have been many sort of great things achieved in the past, but the independent companies and the independent sector in Ireland is by far the richest and most productive. It was disastrously cold after the economic crash, and we're still picking up the pieces of that now. But my company was fortunate enough to survive, and as Morna says, we for the past 20 years have run a training program where it's called SEEDS, which means to seek out, encourage, enable, and stage. And that's actually a kind of good MO for theatre in general, not just for young theatre makers. So that's a kind of little potted history of the company. The work that we did started to expand into classics, and then we began to commission new writing. And one of the plays that we commissioned was Morna, because when Morna was doing Pentecost, and very briefly I'll just talk about Pentecost, it's set during the Ulster Workers' Council strike, where the loyalist faction took down the power sharing executive for the first or second time. And that was a very dark time, because it was as if there was an absolute dissolution of law. There were thugs roaming the streets. People were prevented from going to work, including my father, who was put in the blacklist by loyalists. And it was dark as all get out. And Stuart wrote this play, which ends up, and I won't explain how, with people from every conceivable background in Northern Ireland, including middle-class Catholic, middle-class Protestant, working-class Protestant, Catholic, and working-class Protestant. And this little house managed to contain people with extraordinary barriers around themselves in this space for a kind of lockdown, and they work out a hell of a lot between them. And Morna played the part of Ruth, who has been married to a policeman who has taken a truncheon to her. She's a battered wife, and she comes looking for refuge. And the story of how she works through that problem is one of the spines of the play. But while we were doing that play, it became very apparent to us that there was more to Morna Regan than just being an actor. And I say, and being an actor is an amazing thing, but some people have more dimensions to them. A lot of the writers we commissioned at first were actors, and we really valued that, because they understood what it's like at the coalface of audience reaction, and the audience is who you do it for. And that's crossing a liminal space, which we'll come on to in a bit. But Morna then had been writing a play which she sent to us, and we said we will commission this, and we produced it, and it was called Midden. And if you want to take up the story now, you could maybe tell us a little bit about Midden.
So I guess it's about why I was writing it. So there's a quote in Brian Friel's translations which says, "Confusion is not an ignoble condition," which is one of those statements that you learn and understand over and over again. And so I write from that place. If I don't understand a thing, I feel like I need to go with a piece of paper and a pen, not a computer, connect it to the hand, stay there and try and figure out what it is. And I'm always really careful then. Craft goes on top of that. We were talking about theatre being a liminal space. I might arrive at a conclusion, but if you give a play to an audience and tell them this is your arrival point and tie up in a bow a conclusion and end point, you've killed the play. You've killed theatre. You haven't given them anything except your ego. I think what you should give an audience is questions to take home that will filter down and find their answers weeks later. If you've been successful, they will continue the onward motion of the play for you. So Midden came out of a place. Suddenly I felt like I had arrived. I should be enjoying my arrival because I'm now an actor, a successful professional actor in Ireland, in Irish plays. And we're touring and represent. I had done, Abbey Theatre, National Theatre tours around Europe and America, and toured with Lynne, and and I was in the middle of my Irishness, and I couldn't understand why I was homesick. What was missing? I couldn't. What is this feeling like? Imposter syndrome felt like part of it, or dislocation. Of course, really, what part of that was I am diaspora and still am. I now live in London. So it was about trying to capture that. So Midden is a play about another liminal place that I'm sure we all know well, which is home. What is home? Home is a place that we think we've left, but actually I think we're always striving to arrive at and never do. And it's about a young woman who goes to America from Derry and tries to come back home. And it is not, she realizes really that she has translated home into a place of nostalgia, and that home moved on without her, and that there isn't really space for her. But counterpoint to that, there is a third generation woman. It's 3 generations of the same family, all women. The eldest grandmother is in the same house that she was born in and is also homesick. So there's a counterpoise between what it is that we're all looking for. So that was Midden. And the production was fun. The woman who was in Pentecost with me, who was actually playing my part, when Stuart Parker told me I was going to be in the play, I always envisaged I would be in the other part, Eleanor's part, the Catholic woman. I didn't realise I was going to be playing the loyalist. And I found that such a challenge, such a huge challenge. And in fact, in a rehearsal room in Pentecost on a Friday afternoon when everybody was exhausted, mostly because of me, I had a huge epiphany. I had a monologue, in which my character rises up, and she gives hell to the other woman. And it starts with, "If you're so very superior, Marion, what are you doing here, sitting here in the middle of the night, drinking on your own?" And she starts there, and she lays it out for this woman, everything she thinks is wrong with her state, wrong with her politics, and I couldn't do the speech. I was going up and up and up and up, and the more angry I got, it was like that there, so it was, and it was going higher and higher, and like everybody was just, oh God, is Morna going to do that again? And like, if anyone is fans of Derry Girls and you haven't noticed yet, I'm a Derry girl. That is our accent. We start squeaky and we go squeakier. And I couldn't get it. And I said it out loud in a room full largely of Protestants. I had my epiphany moment and I went, oh my God, I'm fighting like a Catholic. I'm assuming that I'm wrong. I'm fighting from the defense. I've got that upswing in because I don't really want to offend, and I'm asking for permission, and I thought I have to fight like a Protestant. And as Lynne said, you don't even need to raise your voice. So I learned a huge amount about acting and a huge amount about language, dialect, accent, what's coded, decoded. Fascinating stuff. So that was a great moment that has stayed, I think, not just with me. It was an interesting moment in that rehearsal room. So writing. So that I wrote a short film, a half-hour film around the same time, which is the only time I ever addressed my living through the troubles. And it's an 8-year-old girl. And when I was 8, Charlie's Angels was on the TV. I was not allowed to watch it, but I was still totally glamoured by it. And we used to have little handbags and we'd go around like this. And we played Charlie's Angels and solve cases. At the same time, there was I say supermarket, there was a porta cabin at the end of our street, which was the only shop for miles, and it was constantly getting blown up or bomb scared, or you'd be in it and get turfed out, or it was a flashpoint. And we were in it one day and it did get blown up and there was a fatality and it was a time of confusion and it's quite frightening. I was only 7 and really what I remember most is I didn't get my ice cream and my brother got his chocolate because you had to queue longer for ice cream and we didn't have time, which is a very particular childhood memory. But what happened then was my parents wouldn't explain it properly because they thought they were keeping us safe. So on top of living through all that, we were also gaslit because our coordinates were never secure. The reality that we were experiencing was not reflected back through parents who thought, I think Lynne experienced a bit of this as well, parents who were trying to protect us and didn't really explain what you were experientially experiencing in your reality. Anyway, myself and Sabrina and whatever the other girl, Kelly, Kerry, whatever the other angel, we went off to Superfair the next day, which of course was in Smithereens, but outside it was a big skip. And which we couldn't see into. And one of my friends told me that's where all the bodies are, a bit like the description today. And I can still, of course it wasn't, but that's what I believed. And it was horrific. I was very traumatized by that for a while as a small kid. So the film becomes about the emotionality of that moment, not the actuality of it. Where Magella goes to explore a case, she overhears her parents talking about something in a situation and she misunderstands. And the father has to go away to his father's deathbed. And Magella misunderstands and thinks that her mother has killed her father and that's why he's absent. And she's misinterpreting everything in the adult world because nobody's given her coordinates. And I wanted it filmed like Tom and Jerry, for anyone in the room who remembers Tom and Jerry, where all the grown-ups just hover up above the camera, you just see legs, and stay down in this little world and see a different side of the effects of growing up in conflict. So I wrote that. Then my themes are home, place, diaspora themes, housing, for sure. I think one of the problems with Derry has always been no housing. And I've always been really fascinated and angry by empty spaces when other people don't have a space. So the next play that Rough Magic produced for me was a play called For Me, With Me, The Housekeeper, which Lynne commissioned. I won't go into it in huge detail, but it's about someone who takes it into her own hands to take over what she thinks is an empty space, and she literally opens up a hornet's nest. And it is an idea that I'm developing also for TV at the minute, where London is just rife with empty spaces that are actually they're places that have never been homes, were never even viewed, or they just move across big ledgers. They're money laundering places, while there's huge amounts for gangsters and criminalities and oligarchies and kleptocrats and all sorts of scary people, whilst the housing rates are really high. So these are my themes I write to try and understand and hope to bring an audience to some questions, not answers. I don't profess to have any. I'm going to pass it back to you, but remember to ask a little bit about translations, just a few quick things to say about it in a minute. But to go back to Lynne right now, I'd love to ask Lynne a little bit about how she directs.
I suppose we should talk about the liminal spaces of staging. So my preferred way of directing is in the round, which is kind of what Shakespeare's original theatre was, because you have the audience very visible to itself as well as having the cast visible, and it also allows the actors to be to perform in a much more naturalistic way. They don't have to keep turning the performance out and hitting the back wall. It's in a way it's much more filmic, but you have to keep people on the move, otherwise people are blocking people's sightlines. And I do think it's more democratic as well, because you don't get this division between the picture on stage and the experience of the audience. It's much closer, and you can play to many more people without creating that sense of distance. That's one thing. You asked me about the way I stage things with actors, and I replied that really I learned that from reading about Peter Brook and, well, from The Empty Space, basically, because Peter Brook said when he was a young director, he did all the usual things, draw diagrams of where everybody should stand and be very rigid and, you know, like have everything worked out so you really knew what you were doing. And then the actors come on into the rehearsal room and he realizes he's got something much more interesting to play with. And to me, that's the key. And 9 times out of 10, an actor will know where to land on stage. And there are things, there are kind of ley lines, if you know what I mean, on stages. There are parts of the stage that are stronger, not necessarily always downstage center. And when you're in the round, of course, it's fluid. So good actors have really good instincts for this. So you tend to let them follow those instincts. And what I'm kind of a bit fascistic about is adherence to text. And I have a huge respect for the writer, because the writers honed this piece. There's a lot of new theatre making in Ireland, which is devised work and, you know, improvised and stuff like that. I have nothing against that, and some really wonderful pieces have been made from it. But I need a text. I need the crafted piece that carries the ideas to their conclusion. It's not finished, not at all, because obviously it needs the actors and the live performance and the audience to realize itself. But the template for me is the script. So I encourage actors not to try and get off book too early. It's mad. It's not a memory exercise. You have to keep reading it. Otherwise, you're going to start paraphrasing, and then you're just going to fall over your feet. So very simply, that's what I would do. What I do that I think few other directors do is run the play very frequently. At the end of the first week of rehearsals, doesn't matter whether you've made any decisions or not, just get up, stand there, come in, say that, you know, just to see what it's like in 3 dimensions. No decisions are made. And Monday morning, you scrap all that, you go back to the beginning. But you have to keep seeing the thing as a whole. If you just go inch by inch, you're going to forget where you're going, and you're forgetting where you're coming from. The whole thing has to be borne in mind throughout the process. That's kind of it. I think, I mean, I like there's more stuff we could say about this, but yes, absolutely.
I'll keep it short. Because it's so opposite to everything that's been talked about this week, it is a beautiful play for anyone who doesn't know it. It feels to me like it would land with everyone as something that you would understand. It's set in 1830 in Ireland, when the British colonisers are making an ordnance survey map in English of our country. So there's the translations that are going on are of the place names. And of course, it is the ultimate weapon of the colonizer to reduce down where you live and rename it and take it away. But it's also the next thing they did was establish the national school system, which looked like a good thing because everyone was going to get to go to school, but it was through English. So that was going to be the eradication that was of the Irish language. And then very shortly after that, within a decade, the famine came. So the Irish language was pretty much lost. We lost almost a third of the population, so the language was gone. Still survives in pockets and is having a revival through the youth, through a film and a band called Kneecap. For anyone who's a Derry Girl fan, yeah, check it out. You're in for a treat. But there's a beautiful quote from Translations where there's an irony in it, in that Brian Friel wanted to write a play about the Irish language, but he had to write it in English because he had no Irish. So that is the paradox that we're talking about. And the old drunken school teacher speaks to the young English sapper and says, yes, it is a rich language, a rich literature. It is full of the mythologies of hope and fantasies and tomorrows. It is our response, he says. It is our response, I suppose, to mud cabins and a diet of potatoes. We are, I suppose you could call us, a spiritual people. So he's talking about, if you have paucity of material life, you can live a very wealthy, interior, imaginative life. And he goes on then to say, English, I expect, will not be able to express us. And that goes to, again, what Andreas was saying about trying to translate the spirit is very difficult. You might be able to decode or know the passwords of words and in a translation, but the center of the tribe will always be hermetically sealed. But of course, the English weren't attempting to translate us spiritually anyway, so it was a moot point. But I wanted to say that because it resonated quite a lot. I could hear the connections all week to that. So that's all.
Just listening to you talk, it felt so kind of moving and wholesome. And I got to speak to you guys a little bit before this. Big fan of Derry girls. So when Morna said she was from Derry, I literally screamed at her like, "Oh my god!" So it's just so I feel so privileged to be in this space. Something you said that your mother said that really struck me. When she said, "Take that British passport, they owe you." When I went to London for the first time, also from the British Empire, right? From the Caribbean. And my aunt said to me, I'm shaking because she talked about being a black person in London in the 60s. And we talked about this, the signs you would see, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish, in that order specifically, right? And she said, don't ever make them feel that they've given you a favor by giving you this scholarship to study at Cambridge. She said that to me. They owe you, right? They made us work for 400 years for free. And I'm just sitting with that, so many things. Sorry, I'm rambling, but like repair, right? And I think repair, reparations, thinking with that, if you could speak more to that, that idea of you being owed and you standing in the fact that these colonizers are not doing me a favor, right? I feel that that resonated so strongly with me. But also violence, right? The violence of language dispossession, which I can also relate to, right? I don't know the languages my African ancestors spoke when they came to the Caribbean, forcibly brought, right? But also just the violence of like everyday structural realities, right? The violence of spaces you can enter and spaces you can't enter. Thinking about the apartheid legacy here in South Africa, right? And I was speaking to somebody today who said, even though it doesn't exist structurally anymore, there's still that psychological aspect of entering certain spaces and feeling unwelcome, right? I'm gonna stop because I'm gonna take up all the energy in the room. But I thank you so much. This was brilliant. Thank you.
You spoke about how Ireland has, and we all know this, right, a rich history of writing and theatre and poetry, and so I'm thinking about that rich history when one thinks about, of course, Beckett and Wilde, who both born in Ireland, died in France, and how does one, and particularly for you as theatre makers, how does one break free of that tradition? I mean, does one even want to, right? I suppose there's also that. And I'm asking this particularly in thinking about how does one define or think about quote unquote modern Ireland, right? I'm thinking about this in a multicultural or circular kind of sense, right? And my question comes after there's a book that I'm still trying to get my hands on, Queer Notions, by Finla Walsh. I think it talks about new plays and performances in Ireland. And so I just wondered about, because you spoke a little bit about, the tradition and, and the importance of that. And I wonder how that squares, that, I mean, I don't want to say a shadow of that history, right, on new productions and how that plays out. Thanks.
I want to just take us back to Hecuba, if I may. And I just want to ask about the creative decisions that were made regarding Polycena's murder scene, and how that deviates from like Euripides' version. Um, yeah. And also the closing monologue by Cassandra, where she mentions how the tale of what happened will be twisted, and the decisions that went into making those choices.
So the decisions around the script were made before I came into the picture, because Marina actually wrote it before we got hold of it. But the minute I started reading it, what struck me was this extraordinary trick she has of playing both in the present and the past. And of course, we thought long and hard about how to portray these events, which are harrowing. And I thought it would be presumptuous for us to even attempt to stage any of these things. So a more effective way of doing it was by leaning into Marina's technique of grazing the present, or grazing the past within the present, because it is both described and acted. But any attempt we had to make anything literal was just doomed to failure. So it was important to us, and this is actually why the look of it is the way that it is. We also had very little time to get the show into the theatre, so we decided just to set it in an abandoned theatre, as if the catastrophe has happened and people are being rounded up basically to be shipped away, and the abandoned theatre spaces are being used to house people. So that's what the audience came into. And that's why the cast are dressed in very ordinary clothes, as if they're possibly part of the audience. Because we wanted to say, this can happen here, Don't think this can't happen here, because it will happen. So it was a question of as Shakespeare would say, on your imaginary forces work. So we are asking the audience to get involved in the telling of the story, and we'll help by kind of echoing the feeling or the memory of the character of that time, but it's more of a guide than an illustration. So I hope that answers your question. Could I just continue? I'm really interested in this thing about legacy and wild and all that kind of stuff, because Irish linguists dominated the English-speaking theatre from Farquhar and even before Congreve, Sheridan. Congreve was English, but he was brought up in Ireland. And Wilde, of course, was a great Irishman and also queer. So that route is there. And Shaw and Beckett and the whole shebang. So I would kind of feel it's really important, and I think this is important in Rough Magic's work, to keep looking through 360 degrees of history, so that you're not saying only forward. You have to look back at where you've come from to know where you're going to. Interestingly, the recent not that recent, a few years ago, an Irish queer cabaret won the Turner Prize, which is a visual arts prize, but they're a performance group. And I thought, oh, there's hope at last, because in both hardline communities, the LGBTQ plus sector has been roundly dismissed and disparaged by both sides. And here we are, a young generation of performance artists and theatre makers who have been eschewed by their former tribes, and they're going to make their own. And I just thought, there's hope. And that I think is something you can see, that there's queer politics, queer activity growing north and south of the border that is really challenging the status quo. and it's doing it through language as well. And the NECAP are brilliant linguists in both languages, I assure you. And so the heritage of those early Irish writers, I think, is alive and kicking. Language is what is our strength. It's our calling card. It's our global signature. And I think that's what we should continue to draw on. I just want to say something about the divide in Northern Ireland. And this is another border that I think in some ways is misleading, is the Protestant Catholic thing. Northern Ireland is hugely about class. It's not purely about sectarian divides. It is hard sometimes to tell a very, very impoverished working class Protestant that they are privileged, because actually, compared to their middle class Protestant counterparts, they are very underprivileged. So class has always been a huge agent in dividing people and convincing them that the other side has it better, or the class politics are as important as sectarian politics in Northern Ireland. So it doesn't cut just one way, as we keep seeing.
Luando, and I think I'm seeing a very interesting thing happening in terms of how the younger writers and artists are breaking a little bit from tradition, not necessarily breaking from it, but taking from it and building on it, as you would hope. I think the shift is, even with Wilde and Beckett, the writers that we love, there was always a sense of writing about us for other audiences. So be that English drawing rooms or the Yanks and their dollar or whatever it might be. I think what the young people are doing now is very much writing about us for us. So, and it's proving successful. I cannot believe how much Derry Girls travels. And there was no attempt, very little, to tone that down for anyone who wasn't even from Derry. So it's now as if it's a language that travels. And NECAP, same, are very adamant. They're rappers, they rap in Irish. They're very definitely not toning themselves down. A TV show that I work on, Blue Lights, which is a BBC show, it's a police procedural, and it's very, very much, it's a bit like The Wire. It's looking at Belfast as a character as well. It's drawn a definition of the city for the people who live there. And it's a huge global hit. So I think, as Lynne says, we're building on a rich tradition of writers and a heritage that and a gift maybe that we have for that. But it does seem to be taking a shift in direction. And just quickly to what Fatima said, thank you. I can't say that I feel I am owed. My mother felt I was owed. That's very different. I definitely feel imposter syndrome. I am dying inside right now, and it's not an apology, because I'm older now, and none of us should ever apologize for ourselves. That feeling has never gone away. I think that's partly being colonized. So I wish I could say that I did feel I was owed, and I took maybe in moments, but generally not. But it was great to find such similarities in each other the other night. I really enjoyed that conversation. You all missed out. Thank you.
We want to bring us back to Hecuba, the film we were watching. And I was very much interested in the set design, because I saw that for example, in the set, there were a lot of chairs stacked in the set, and there were also, for example, when a character disappears out of scene, they do not completely disappear, but we can still see them. And I was interested in the thinking around that, because I know there's always intentionality around the set design and what it presents. And also, there was also something that's, is it strike or stroke? Yeah, strike. Strike me, yeah, stroke. Because I'm always interested in discourse analysis, why we say what we say. And I was very much, I found interest in the I say, he says, that the characters kept evoking, and I was interested in the politics of that. And also, lastly, to keep it short, I'm interested in the relationship between the writer and the director, because I know that there are times whereby when what the writer writes cannot be made possible through film, and like it cannot be easily portrayed in production. And I was interested in, when does the negotiation, I mean, between the writer and the director begin? Does it begin in the writing process, like when the writing process begins, or like just the dynamics between the relationship between the writer and the director?
What do you think is the role of humor? I mean, I'm married to an Irish man. There is something about humor and playfulness in this kind of way you can be so critical of things and get away with so much, but without meaning to generalize. But even when you were talking, making us laugh, this was a great performance, and you were saying serious things. So I'm just kind of wondering, and also having Irish friends, there is something around humor that is used to be critical, to say things in a very playful way.
I wondered about the 1980s, and partly because, there is a cultural movement that kind of comes into being in South Africa that we are trying to wrap our heads around. And I'm thinking a little bit about what Field Day's work looks like and what was happening in cinema. So Richard Harris in The Field, there were all these films that suddenly emerged that looked at the problem of Northern Ireland as a larger question of Ireland as such. And I wonder if you can say a little bit about what that crossover across genres looks like. Because I'm also now trying to think about what a writer like Anna Barnes looks like, Milkman in particular, in theatrical terms, or is it Paul Lynch and that work? Is there any translation across genres that will help us to identify what's shifted in Irish theatre now, as opposed to what Field Day Company might have been doing in the 1980s?
My question also returns back to the film that we watched. Beautiful, beautiful film. And particularly around the process in which you went about translating the theatrical experience through the camera into a film, and how did you negotiate the camera as you were performing?
My question actually adds to the last one that was just asked. I was just wondering, I mean, you could conceive of the film that we actually watched as existing in a liminal space as well. Because I think traditionally the rule of thumb is that you should not film a live performance. I mean, opera or dance or theatre on stage, it's a live experience. There's a kind of energetic experience that happens. And when you film it, it often loses that. So traditionally, the rule of thumb has been when you make a film about dance or theatre or opera, you restage it, you recreate it as a film. So when I started personally watching the film, I thought, oh no, this is going to be a play filmed on stage. But after a few minutes, it just totally worked. So it went against this kind of idea I have of two separate spaces. And I think part of that is the narrativization, the third person narrative. I think that gives another kind of point of view, which in some way kind of frames your audience's point of view at looking. But I think it also simply had to do with brilliant acting. So I was just to add to the question, I was just wondering what kind of decisions, or how did you think about the idea of doing something which has conspicuously failed many times before? In this case, it did not.
I suppose it does start in the writing process, because I know that when I sit down to write, I'm negotiating relationships all the time. That is what it is about. I'm negotiating the relationship between the characters, between myself and the characters, then between a character who might go rogue, doing things I'm not expecting them to do, shaping that. And always I'm holding it always in conversation with the audience. It's all, the audience are always present. And in all of that, I'm aware of the magic of theatre, that I'm kind of holding the director, and in my experience, that's always Lynne, in conversation as well, but without it being an active conscious thing, because there's so much trust there. Lynne and I both understand and believe in the theatre of magic, that I can write anything and she will make it happen. And will honour as much as is ever possible. She will make the thing that I am writing be as rigorous and as strong and the best version of itself that it can be. She will prod me and provoke me, and we will toss it backwards and forwards in a joyous way, not an antagonistic way. As she said herself, she is a writer's director. So yes, I would say, thank you for the question. Just very quickly on humour, yes, you're absolutely right. It is Brechtian, for want of another word, technique. It affords critical distance so that you can look at a thing without being offended or upset. You get a moment of distance, and you can, and you're invited in, and it's sort of challenged to come in and think about it. Pramesh, I'll think about your question some more, and we can chat about it. I mean, one interesting thing that came out of that was Lynne and I tried to get the rights to The Milkman to do an adaptation for stage, and we couldn't get it. She's brilliant, Anna Barnes. She was like, my characters don't want to do that, so I don't think anybody's getting the rights. I'm not sure that I know the answer to your question, so maybe that's a discussion that we can have. I'd love to have it. But I think Lynne has more interesting things to say right now. Pass it over. Than me waffling about something I don't really know.
Well, humor is essential in that it's the mischief. All theatre really has to be subversive in some ways, and getting the giggles in church is kind of like where it starts when you're a kid, and you want to keep that feeling going because it's the safety valve. Just in terms of staging, and I'm going to try and mix the Hecuba questions together. The staging for our production, I've sort of touched on it a bit, but maybe just to expand. At first, I thought I was going to be doing the play somewhere else, and it was a civic theatre, and then there was a huge sort of barn space that we were going to use, and finally that couldn't get its fire cert and all sorts of things, so we ended up in a studio space. The idea of the cast always being there in the actual show, of course, they're surrounded by the audience as well. They're not so visible, but we still thought that was worth doing because the people in the space are telling the story. They're not saying, I am Hecuba. We'll believe you're Hecuba if you convince us. But it's as if these modern Irish people are channeling this story, you know? So there's no, and everyone's telling everybody everything. And it's a kind of testimony. So it's kind of saying, well, who do you believe in this? These two characters are completely contradicting each other. Who are you going to believe? So that's part of the game of the piece. And the staging was like the original, when the audience was there, you didn't see so much of the chairs. So actually the film makes them more visible, but it's as if the theatre has been abandoned, really. So that they were in the middle of a fit up, all the trussing's down, there's lights on the floor, there's the sound desk, and it's just as if somebody said, get out of here now, you have 20 seconds, leave everything. And that the people who are playing the piece, they're then just brought into it. And just the translation into camera, I have to say that it was the director of photography, Colm Hogan, who really, really pulled that out of the bag. I'm not trained in theatre, and I'm not trained in theatre, but I'm definitely not trained, but I have been working in theatre for 40 years. I've never made a film. So I was really trusting to him. What we did decide to do was that when the piece was originally staged in the round, it was true that sometimes you weren't able to access the actors' faces in the same way. So the whole gig was getting as close to those actors as possible because they really can take it. And then just using the sense of the people in the room as the backdrop to the story. I suppose that was the decision that we made. And then the other hero of this was Tony Cranston, the editor, who took all the stuff we managed to get in that 5-day period with all the COVID restrictions and make it into this fluid piece. I don't know how he did it. But as you say, you know, the actors are strong. That's what you really need. The script and the actors. That's all you need, really. In terms of realizing a piece, there's a nice quote from a designer where a director actually says to the designer, I want a lake here. And the designer says, what is it about lakeness that you're actually looking for? Because of course you can't put a lake on stage, but you can find the thing about the lake that is needed for the production. In theatre, you can do literally anything, and you can't in film. So I think theatre is the more powerful of the two media.